I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. The board secretary will note at this time the meeting has commenced at
46?
Yeah, it's 10:46, can't see it. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to welcome everyone to the public session of today's board meeting. My name is Brian Smith, and Vice Chair of the board, and I will be chairing the meeting on behalf of Tim Murphy, who unfortunately is out of the country. And we also have regrets from two other board members, Anna and Nick, who are not able to join us today. But other than that, we have quorum, and the meeting will commence. So I'd like to welcome everyone and start the meeting. Toronto Community Housing acknowledges that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I also want to mention today that our normal practice of this morning's meeting and previous meetings, we're live streaming on the internet. Greetings to those who are following us online. However, for the first time, the live stream will be recorded and subsequently posted on Toronto Community Housing's YouTube channel. So this will enable tenants who are unable to attend either in person or online meeting will be able to follow it live while at a later date on the YouTube. I understand that tenants have been asking for this for some time, and I'm pleased that we are now following the example of City Council and other city agencies such as the TCHC in providing greater public access to the discussions that take place at the board table. Going forward, we will archive these recordings of our board meetings and board committee meetings online. Links to the archived files will be available on the Toronto Community Housing's website for ease of access. Staff from several business units worked together on this project, and I want to thank them for their efforts in making our new board archives a reality. So that's greatly appreciated. It is customary for the chair to report out on decisions made during the confidential portion of the meeting. And this morning, the board met in camera, and we will meet in a confidential session after this public session concludes. So there are no decisions to report out at this time. Decisions made during the upcoming confidential sessions will be reported out at our next board meeting or on the Toronto Community Housing Company's website. Turning to the public session, we will have updates from our board committee chairs, and Kevin Marshman will update the board on the CEO's business plan and the operational performance measures. Adele will bring forward for approval the business plan for Fir Grove Grassy Ways revitalization. The business plan includes a master plan for rebuilding and renewing the Fir Grove community to improve the lives of 600 existing tenants and allow currently relocated tenants to return home and reestablish a healthy, vibrant Fir Grove community. The business plan also includes recommendations to pursue contributions from all three levels of government and partnerships with the private sector to secure full funding for the revitalization. I look forward to the board's discussion this morning If approved by the board, Fir Grove will be one of the first 3 of our projects to move forward to the City of Toronto under the new approval framework for Toronto Community Housing Corporation's revitalizations. The framework was put in place earlier this year to promote greater collaboration on broader city building objectives, such as increasing the stock of affordable rental housing. That concludes my opening remarks, and I thank you very much for your attendance today and being part of the meeting today. Thank you. So, deputations.
You can approve the agenda with that amendment that we discussed.
Yes.
And a conflict of interest.
So at this point, I'd like to ask the board to approve the agenda and with the one amendment to add to the agenda. Michael and John, thank you.
Yes. 7.
Just at this point, I'd like to just go through explain the deputation process for today's meeting. Deputations from the public are intended to further the board's understanding of the issues relating to an agenda item. Deputations are not a forum to ask questions or engage in debate. We will hear from persons who signed at the registration table or who identified themselves at this time or who have made a request through the board secretary through the normal channels and who are speaking to an item on the agenda. We will hear deputations when the agenda item arises, and I will call the speakers in the order that their names appear on the list, then poll from other deputants who wish to speak on each item. To give everyone on the list an opportunity to speak, I will hold each deputant to a maximum of 5 minutes. Staff will use the timer and will alert me and when the 5 minutes is drawing to a close so that I can ask the speaker to wrap up. Each speaker should make efforts to bring forth new information that will help the board to understand the specific issue. Let us all be respectful of each other and engage in productive discussion. Please make your way up to the podium when called, and please use the microphone at the podium so that everyone can hear you, and of course will be recorded as part of our change in the YouTube process. There will be. We'll make sure there's a microphone. So, obviously, that's not much help without a microphone. So
We can
go to the
conflicts.
So at this point, I would like to ask the board if there are any conflicts of interest with regards to any of the items on the agenda. Seeing no conflicts, should I mention the item 7 being added?
Yes.
So we've added one agenda item, which is item number 7, which is CMHC National Housing Co-Investment Fund, which we will bring forward in the course of the agenda. So that's an added item to the agenda. Can I ask for a motion to approve the public consent agenda? Sorry.
We actually have, and perhaps before the board considers whether it will approve the consent agenda, Mr. Avila sought to depute in relation to 2 of those items, item 2C and 2D.
So you're asking to hold those two items, or?
Yes.
Yes.
So we'll hold those, just hold for a minute. We're just going to approve the agenda, holding those two items for discussion. So could I ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda except for items
C and D.
C and D? Debbie and Adele? Or move and second that. All those in favor of the consent agenda with those two items? Thank you. Okay. So do you want to do those items then? No?
Yes.
So item
2C.
2C, confirmation of Board of Directors public meeting minutes. So I'd ask, I want to speak to both of them. Miguel?
Matt is arising out of the minutes.
Yes.
So, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about these two items. I'm going to combine my deputation 2C and 2D. All right. With regards to the approval of the tenant engagement system, it's not my intention to reopen the debate, but perhaps you guys can talk in your private in camera. Okay, so this is how it goes. Regent Park has, parallel to the tenant engagement process, has had their own election process. Now, when we approved the tenant engagement system, in June the 29th, all tenant reps ceased to be tenant reps. So we out of work. Now what happened is that I am a part of the tenant advisory committee for 220 Oak Street, as we are investing in consultation with tenants in regards to the total renewal of our building. I learned that the OUM, when requested for one of the tenant reps from the previous election, said, do I need to run for election? The answer was, no, you stay put in your seat. You don't have to run for re-election. And that's when I said to myself, there's something wrong here. Because if we have been told, each and everybody, that we stop being tenant reps, we have now to run again to one of the three options. So I find it a bit unfair that some tenant reps in my building, 220 Oak Street, and similarly for the tenant reps at the Regent Park revitalization, I think they need to align with the tenant engagement process so that we have a fair process for everybody to run, instead of having someone just to sit down and say, well, don't worry, my seat is taken, don't worry about that. So I've been trying to reach Debbie Mendez for forever, to reach out to him. I even spoke to the ombudsman, and the ombudsman says, come back to TCHC board, because they have their complaint process where we can talk to the board about these issues. So I've had the opportunity to talk about these issues. Secondly,
Sorry, Miguel, just so I understand it, I just want to make sure I understand what you've said. We had a process established that was agreed to after discussion with tenants and was passed by the board. And we have situations in certain areas within the portfolio, so specifically at Regent Park or Oak, where and a person working for TCHC has told the tenant rep that they don't need to run for office, that they're approved, and that's not what was agreed to. Okay, so we will fix that, because just so you know, the reality is that we established a process. It was after extensive debate, with tenants, and it went through a couple, certainly more than one revolution and change, and was approved by the board. And by the way, we've stopped them. Good. Yeah, good. I just thought about it.
I got more to say.
So I wanted to get clarity, because we should be consistent in how we're delivering, and you have our commitment that we will do that.
Don't you agree, people?
Okay.
Consistency.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
yes, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to bring to attention is that we face a problem with installation of the CCTV cameras at 220 Oak Street. we have been told that they are not going to install cameras in the staircases. So I took the time to collect signatures, and I had this petition signed by 195 tenants who agree with me that we need to have security in our staircases for the benefit of all the service providers like EMS, Toronto Fire Services, mental health workers, because a lot of stuff goes on in those staircases. And you know that we have one shooting of a 16-year-old boy in New York, and on the 13th floor, I believe, there are no cameras installed on each floor. We have a problem with that. We had to find somehow uniformity so that no building has less cameras than versus more cameras. We had to have some even playing field, right? So that's my request. So I want to take home with me a hope for my tenants through this petition that you guys are going to deliver on installing cameras on the staircases, because it's for the safety of everyone. Everybody will benefit from cameras. So I'm going to hand over the petition to the secretary for action.
Thank you for
And that
that.
concludes my deputation. Oh my God, in less than 5 minutes, total record.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel.
Thank you.
And maybe we, just as a board comment, Linda, we could follow up with that at Tenant Services Committee as well to monitor, and we can talk about these issues more.
I think the board may also want some more information on what's happening with cameras in the staircase. I see a lot of people actually.
Yeah, and so I think what we'll do, not only at Tenant Services, but at BIFAC as well, and to the board in general, is kind of what is the approach that we take to cameras, and you know, we're rolling out cameras. We're not at end of job yet, but in terms of what is that approach, why do we take that approach, and then we can seek direction, you know, on that. Okay, thanks.
So those are the only deputants on those two items. We can move and adopt those closed matters.
So at this point, I'd look for a motion to adopt those two items on the consent agenda.
So
Linda?
on 2C?
On 2C, and can we do it together, or?
Sure.
2C and 2D. So Linda and Michael,
And just
all those in favor? Carried. Okay, Kevin?
well, I was just going to say, just for good governance and recording in the action items coming out of this meeting, the consistency in the application of the tenant engagement process should be an action item, you know, that comes out of this, and that we will report back, you know, on the communication in that regard at the next meeting.
Great. At this point, I'd like to ask Kevin to provide the President and CEO's remarks, and
So we've got three deputants who want to make comments with respect to that matter. The first is Mr. Avila.
sure.
All right. This will be a very brief deputation. On July 19, as you are aware, I came in and presented you with a letter requesting the Community Safety Unit to listen to the recommendations by the city executive with regards, city council, decision with regards the anti-black racism strategy, that we need to embed it in the training of our Community Safety Unit officers. I don't need to repeat what it has happened to come to this decision by City Council. I think Councilor Fletcher is aware of that. Those who sit at the TCHC board as well, councilors, you are aware what happened with the streetcar and the TTC fare collector? Shameful, right? So we need to make changes that we don't have to see this duplicity at TCHC, because we are just incorporating more officers. But I want to know for sure they're listening to the City Council direction to incorporate this guidance from the city. That's it. That's my deputation. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a very good recommendation. Thank you, Miguel.
Just keep pushing it.
The second deputant is Ms. Duggan.
If I'm not mistaken, there's quite a few people here at the board that should be anticipating this moment. What I have for you today is a petition from 31 Gilder. I've spent the last 2 days writing up the petition and having 99 tenants sign it. I will be the 100th here today. And this deputation is regards to page 4 of 3A, which is under 6.2, revised use of space agreements with partners. Let me just sign this here. And I think one of those agreements you need to look at very closely is the one with Toronto Early Learning and Childcare Services. I'll make this as simple as possible. At this point, we, the tenants at 31 Gilder Drive, demand that Toronto Early Learning and Childcare Centre, in collaboration with Toronto Community Housing, put an immediate halt to any plans of installing an infant playground at the west side of the building, the side that tenants consider the front and architects interpret as the back, thereby honoring an email stating that there will be no infant playground. And that was sent to me on July 18th, 2019, 9:57 a.m. You guys want copies of that email? Just let me know. We, the tenants at 31 Gilder Drive, also insist that until such a time as consultations have taken place between Toronto Early Learning and Childcare Centre, concerned staff, including our TCHC site superintendent Dave Smollett and TCHC Community Services Coordinator Mike Morgan, our tenant rep Marlene Marcourt, and myself, Cheryl Duggan, all TELCCS construction at 31 Gilder in the old playground be stopped to ensure that the plans don't further encroach on green space, meet current accessibility requirements, and maximize safety for the residents of 31 Gilder, while not presenting additional health and safety risks to staff and children utilizing the daycare's outdoor playground in the future. Highlighting the incident involving one of the sheds as an analogy for the totality of this project, the Toronto Early Learning and Childcare Centre at 31 Gilder has twice been told where not to put their sheds by myself. The next time I may tell them where to put it in not so colorful terms. They were originally going to place it on our basketball court over the summer, and that's the only place that our youth have to vent off their high energy. Then last Friday, discussion had to be derailed as they were discussing placing it within climbing distance of that balcony extension of mine. Until now, they have had no inclination to consult with the community at large, nor individual stakeholders like the TCHC superintendent, nor the community service coordinator, nor the tenant rep, nor myself. This needs to change immediately. Now, I'm not asking for anything that I haven't given up myself in the past. When I went to the City of Toronto for PLL funding for our community, I made sure that I had the supervisor for the daycare at the time on our committee. So I'm not asking for something that I already haven't given in the past. I want full disclosure. I want to see plans. I don't want to have to take shots, like camera shots, over someone's shoulder because they don't want to hold it up and make it look pretty for me, okay? We should know what's happening in our own community. And honestly, we could have helped them find solutions to their problems right now. I don't like going around and following them around with my camera and my tape recorder and just kind of trying to eavesdrop when we should already know what's happening. So, like I said, here's the petition. Seems to be your day for petitions.
Cheryl, Annette, it's the partner that we're working with on this one, I just want to make sure I've got it right, is Toronto Early
Learning and Childcare Services.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's, you know, and don't feel bad. I will be dropping off a copy at their head office today as well as at the mayor's office.
Oh, I encourage you to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon.
Our final deputant is Ms. Birch.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, directors, Mr. Marshman. I'm here today because I have a problem and I need you to help me fix it. And that is that the agenda for this board meeting did not go on the website until Monday. Now, we have policies in place that say that give specific timelines, and for our board to make sure that materials are available, so that people know whether they want to attend, whether it be people with disabilities in particular, because we have to have time for our Wheel-Trans, but just stakeholders in general. We have a right to know what's going to be at this meeting. The problem I've got is when we have management and staff that have policies in that, and I stick to them like bad flypaper when they don't mean it. And you can probably look behind me and look at all of them shaking their head yes. How can I hold them accountable if our own board who signs off and makes these rules does not abide by them? This doesn't happen at the city. Those agendas are up, even if they have to revise them, but they're up. I thought it was actually a fluke on the weekend when it wasn't there, so I emailed communications to say, hey, if you think it's up, it's not up on the external side. And I find out that they're not actually responsible for getting the agenda up on the website. So I want to know from you wise people who are in charge of this corporation, how do I hold my management and my staff accountable to follow the rules if you guys aren't?
Let me start with that, Kathy. It's inexcusable that the agenda wasn't up earlier and the materials weren't up earlier, and I apologize on behalf of the organization for it. It won't happen again.
I can't hold them accountable.
I agree. We are accountable. We screwed up on this one, and I'm sorry that we did.
Just one other thing, I do have complaints about on the live feed that this mic is not being picked up. Now, I understand there's been some changes, so we need to make sure that this mic is being picked up.
Well, and I think the advantage that we're recording this as well will identify it. So if you hear that that's still the case, please let Dara know, or
Okay.
myself, but ideally Dara, and we'll make sure that we fix that.
Okay, great.
Okay?
Thank you.
I mean, we're definitely committed to making this as accessible as possible, so, this is our first time. Hopefully, we'll get it right.
Well, I don't even know what this CMHC stuff, it could be something that I would have wanted to depute on, and so now I don't even have that opportunity, because
Let me just address that. The timing of that was driven by the city, and I'm not laying it off on the city. It was something that we could have discussed in the confidential session. Part of what I'm trying to get to is how can we get more and more things discussed in the open session of it, including a number of contracts that we approve in BIFAC and at the board, typically in the confidential session. So the material from the city just got dropped yesterday, so you will still have, it's being heard at executive committee.
Okay.
And so you still will have an opportunity to depute on this. But before it gets heard at executive committee, because we are a party to that contract, then we need to approve it here at the board before the city can consider it. And so that is a particularly unique circumstance on that. But in terms of the overall ensuring that we get the board agendas out, ideally in 10 days, no less than 7 days before the meeting is something that I'm committed to. And generally, I think we've been hitting it, but I apologize that we didn't do it this time, and there's no excuse for it.
Terrific, thank you.
Okay.
That's it.
So there are no more deputants in relation to this matter.
Okay.
So, Kevin.
So just in terms of I'll take the material as written. There's a few comments that I would like to say before I actually get to the specifics, and I'm going to combine item 3A and 3B. On the agenda here, that I alluded to it when I was responding to Kathy's deputation. But one of the things, Sorry. Oh, is that you?
Your time's up. Sorry, Kevin.
Clearly, I'm too verbose. So, one of the things that Dara and I have been spending some time about, is there is a lot of material that we discuss in confidential session, and there has been a history of us discussing things in confidential session, and it tends to lead to a perception that we're secretive. And perhaps that there is some justification for that in terms of how that originally got done. There is not an intent for us to be secretive beyond what is corporately responsible today, and I don't think that is secretive. I think that's just good governance and good execution. So Dara and I are looking at what other agencies do. The reason some of the contracts have not been put forward is we thought that we were kind of sharing information in terms of where the other bid providers came up and so on and so forth. And I think that there's probably ways around that. We haven't got the solution, but we expect when we come to the next meeting that you will see a lot more meat on the public agenda than you have historically seen, and a lot less on the confidentials and in-camera agenda, so that we can be more transparent. This is a journey. This is not a destination. We will continue to work on that. And in that regard, we're also looking at how we can be more effective in terms of our deputations and having, because if you recall, back in 2015 and earlier, that when deputants came forward, with comments to the board that, we did, there was no discussion on, there were no questions of the deputants, there was no kind of discussion around the board relative to those deputations. At least certainly that was my experience when I joined the board. And so we recognize that that's a bit of a dated process, and we want to work on that. And that's something that I've talked to Tim, our board chair, about, and we have, in general discussion, had that discussion, around the board table. So we haven't got a perfect solution yet, but we're working on it. And so one of the reasons, the CMHC document was originally scheduled to be discussed, in the confidential session. I thought, this is not a surprise for everybody. I mean, the Prime Minister announced it in April. We had a further announcement a couple of weeks ago. And so, I just thought we're going to start there. So I just wanted to have that as a lead-in before I talk, specifically about some of the things that took place within the last couple of months at the organization. And I think, and so Miguel, I'm glad that you commented on the tenant engagement refresh, because, if I looked at where we're tracking against the corporate objectives, tenant engagement refresh is still one of the items that is, that is showing yellow, and that is because it's behind time in terms of our delivery on that. And so that was bought back into the process. We're moving forward on that after it received board approval. I also want to talk in terms of the other couple of items that are in it that are still yellow within item 3A, and that has to do with the contract management teams. So these are the buildings that are managed either by Greenland or Dell. We are making progress in terms of the improvement in the performance indicators around those contracts, but it is still not where we want it to be, and so that's why we have classified it as yellow, and it's a journey that we are still working on. I also wanted to talk about, with regard to the large IT project that we have going on, where we're called IHMS, and it's got a new handle on it, Comes Homes now. But the reason it is yellow is because the approval and the start of that process was delayed. The total IT project is in fact still expected to take the allocated time that it was, but it started later, so it's going to finish later. The preliminary discussions that I have had with the team is and IT projects, the other thing that people are usually quite worried about on those is what's the spend going to be like that, and the spend looks like that it's going to be less than budgeted at this juncture, so that's good news, as opposed to people are telling me, well, it could be a little bit higher, and that is not the case in this particular project. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm glad also that we got the comment on the use of space agreements and specifically, around our partners. There was a motion at the city earlier this year, which has put a lot of this use of space agreement development on hold, but we're at a process where I think we can restart that, that piece of it, and we will be working very closely with our partners and the city as we move forward in that regard. With regard to the the performance and operations, the metrics, that are there. I'm certainly open to answering any questions that the board members may have. I will speak to a couple of items here. One is when we look at the infestation section of the report, you'll notice that the demand roach treatments has increased substantially between June and July of this year. We have was not unexpected on our behalf. We had a increased number of building cleanouts that took place where we were treating the entire building. These are undertaken when the prevalence of pests continue to raise itself and exceeds our established thresholds. So these cleanouts, provide us with an opportunity to treat the building holistically as opposed to from suite to suite. And so we will continue to monitor that element. Oh, Cheryl wanted to debate on 3B. I'm sorry, Cheryl. I understand that we have a deputation on 3B, and so I'll ask Cheryl if she can come forward on that. Sure. Right.
Okay, I just want to kind of drop a couple points. Again, with the infestations, I'm wondering, I'm not usually like to complain about, a couple pugs wandering into the unit across the hall because I have an English bully myself, and my dog, the one I used to have, Frankie, who died when he was 15, he was a pug. So I'm kind of partial, but they keep coming in every Friday, and I'm like, why are they coming in every Friday? So I asked the super, and he's like, well, the unit keeps getting, fumigated every week. And I'm like, okay. So are we tracking how many times an individual unit is treated?
So the answer to the question is yes, we have that information. So we know which units are treated when. The further answer to the further question in it is it reviewed and analyzed, at my level within the organization? Not yet, but it is one of the things that I'm trying to get my attention to.
Okay, because what I'm wondering is, I know that from reading the report that when they do the full building treatment, that's warranted, but are we still paying every week when they come out to do that one unit? It's just...
If it's under warranty, we should not be, but if we've done selective units within the building, my guess is, and Graham, you can correct me. Oh, it's all under warranty. Okay.
All right. Top of page 10, it states 14% increase in arrears in one-time charges to tenant accounts. Is there any way you can tell us what those charges could be?
Yes, I'll ask Graham to speak to that once I finished my comments on arrears, and arrears was one of the things I was going to comment on.
Okay, and with respect to crimes against property and crimes against persons, I'd like to know personally, is anyone tracking the solved rates as well as the reporting rates?
The
solved rates as well as reporting rates.
Assault rates.
Solved rates is if the cases have been solved, yes.
Oh, the solve rates. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Thought I'd ask.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Is Bill here?
Assault.
Is Bill
No,
here?
solved.
No, the
SOLVE.
solve. How many get?
Sorry.
How many get resolved? Okay.
How many get resolved
Yeah.
versus reported?
Okay, under fire incidents, could we not also publish the false alarm rates and the cost of those?
We can certainly look into that.
Okay. And one item I find missing that I still have an issue with is recycling. If we could get that documented as to how many, bins we should be recycling versus what we're actually recycling, and get some kind of plans in place for that, some kind of graphic, something.
So something like recycling
some
effectiveness.
targets, yes. Some light targets so that we can we'll aim low first and then just gradually increase the target.
Right. And at least if we start tracking it, then we can start to measure it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank
fair
you.
enough.
You get it.
And just the thing on resolve rates, because I don't think Bill's in the room, is he? Oh, okay. But my guess is, and come and speak to it if need be, is that, it's not that CSU solves the crime. Obviously, I know that. That's something within the TPS. And so is there do you want to just speak to it just while we're here for this moment? Thanks.
Okay, and that's it for my questions on that piece.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you, Cheryl.
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Al Britton. I'm the senior manager, the deputy chief special constable to Bill Anderson. Bill's away on a conference this week. So just in response to the question, Toronto Police do keep track of the solvency rate. In our particular circumstance, we could look at what we solve ourselves. A lot of the crimes that we're reporting are investigations by Toronto Police. So it's kind of a hybrid of both. So we could definitely track our own, and we can work with Toronto Police to provide that.
Yeah.
Yes,
If we could work for the cases that happen on our properties, you know, and typically, I think we're pretty much involved in all of them, because TPS usually calls us in if there's an assault or if there's some crime against an individual on our property. Is that not the case?
We're notified and we're definitely involved. We're not always privy to all the details because some,
And
for some reason,
I understand that they may have some reasons that they don't give us, but if we can get an understanding with TPS that as they solve a crime,
Yes.
that occurred on our property, that they report that out to us
Yes.
in the detail, then we can start to track that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is that all the deputations? That's it?
Was that the?
So you want to
Okay.
continue on, Kevin?
Sure. So I won't speak about the road treatments because I think we did speak to that just in terms of our dialogue around it. You know, with regard to the growth in arrears, and there's been, and I'm going to get Graham to speak, to augment what I'm going to say. But as you noticed, as you commented, there was a significant growth between July and of last year and July of this year. We've seen an 18% increase in the value of arrears payments, despite that there's only an increase of 6% in the number of units. So what that tells us is an indication of the delays between the initial accumulation of arrears and negotiation of the repayment agreement. It also could be an indication of how quickly we are getting to getting to address the initial arrears that are coming. And so the average value of arrears when reaching the landlord-tenant board now has reached 31%, which also indicates a delay in terms of the management of that flow through. And as well, rental charges have increased, and so that typically kind of rolls into the arrears piece as well. And some of that was related to increases that occurred in the previous year in the minimum wage, but then flowed through to incomes in our tenants. And as you know, our tenants' rental amount is based on their overall income. As part of the plan that we have in place for this year, we are conducting a significant review of the arrears collection process, and we're doing this in collaboration with OACH. And Cynthia and I had a discussion around some of those elements of it just this past week, and as well our QP partners in 79. And so the intent is that we are going to report out to that on the board at that in the next meeting. And Graham, did you want to add any further comments on the arrears? Then I'll move to the next subject.
Just to answer Ms. Duggan's question about the increase in retroactive charges. Retroactive charges emerge when, as part of the annual rent review process for tenants, we discover undisclosed income from the previous year, which should have been factored into their rent calculation. When we do find that out, we have to effect a retroactive charge to that account. We're finding that more frequently, which is a good thing insofar as our tenancy administration, and the value of those respectively has been going up year over year as well. Our outstanding rent review rate is very low. It's meeting the target at less than 5% for the first time in a long time, so that contributes to that charge growing year over year as well.
Okay, and actually, Graham just reminded me of one of the points that Cynthia and I discussed, retroactive charges in the seniors portfolio. And in that regard, there are various things that will kick in from government support when seniors turn 65, and some of those happen automatically, and some of those you actually have to apply for. And so very often I suspect that there's a lag time between when seniors turn 65 and when they actually make the applications for some of the supports that they need to apply for from the government. So what happens is that they get a retroactive lump sum from the government, which affects their income. And one of the things that Cynthia and I were talking about is an education program and how do we try to get out in front of it. So firstly, the seniors get to apply for the supports on a more timely basis so that they get the funding when they need the funding, so as soon after they turn 65 as is possible, and then also to help them understand the implication of this that it has relative to their rent, so that they can plan more effectively in terms of budgeting the spending of their money. And so that's one of the items that in terms of as we work through how to be more effective in the whole arrears management, that's just one kind of small item that we're thinking of, but I thought I would share that with you. With regard to, performance, the safety performance, we have seen, an increase in crimes against property, in particular, and a substantial increase. Some of that we think, there's still more analysis going on, but some of that we think is due to, the realignment that we've done of our CSU officers, where it's the same CSU officers showing up in the community so that there's a greater familiarity and a greater chance for tenants to connect with CSU officers on particular issues. But we don't think that's the whole issue, and we're continuing to investigate that further. And I think just with that, I will open it up for if there's any particular questions that the directors have.
So, questions from the board? Linda, and then John?
Quick point of clarification, so the report that the board asked for with regards to the OACH recommendations, that will be coming to the next board meeting?
That is coming up. I think it's actually going to come to Tenant Community Services because I think that is before the board meeting, but it will come to the board meeting, yes, as well. Yep.
John?
TCHC has roughly 60,000 units, is that correct?
58 and change.
And we've got almost 10,000 units that are in arrears. Is that what I have? Here on page, I've got 9,900 units as of July the 2019, almost 10,000. That's like 16.5%. Has this been a trend that's been going on? I mean, I know it's up over last year. Has it been an increasing trend month over month? And I mean, what? I know that OACH deals with the hardest issues. What is the action plan to reverse this?
Well, so arrears structurally have been designed to go up over a period of time. TCHC moved a number of years ago, and I'll get Graham to speak in further detail, John, on this item. But as a result of a senior individual who was evicted and ended up dying in the halls, there was I think it was an ombudsman report, Paula, was, if I'm correct on that came out essentially and addressed this issue of the arrears process. And so the focus shifted after that, and there was an acceptance by the board at the time and TCHC management to try to maintain tenancies. So not be as a typical landlord would be, that if you miss typical landlords do a number of things that we don't do, and they're geared around ensuring that they collect their money, and they collect their money quickly, and they will evict you very quickly if you don't pay your rent. The process at TCHC is really around trying to ensure that tenancies are maintained, and we work with tenancies. So one of the things that's happening and that's driving arrears is that we are negotiating more repayment agreements, and all of that money stays in arrears until the repayment agreement is satisfied. We are also finding, as we go to the landlord-tenant board, two issues there. The backlog at the landlord-tenant board is quite substantial, and so very often we will have a hearing scheduled, and it will be deferred to the next time. So there's just a continuing lag time, at which point in time arrears will continue to grow. In addition to that, particularly if it is for financial reasons, the landlord-tenant board looks at it and said, well, if they're not housed at TCHC, where in fact will they go live? And so even if we, and so we typically end up in more mediated agreements as a result of that. And so those are all structural issues. Having said that, I still think that there are things, within the arrears process, that we can do better. And this is part of this thing that, and let me just finish that, I'll turn it back over to you. This is part of this, what is the process? How do we get engaged earlier so that that we get in front of the discussion with the tenant earlier in the process about not paying the rent, so that we can work on a solution on a much smaller number than a larger number. Some of it is just volume related, and we need to address that. So let me turn it back over to you. I'm sure you have supplementals.
So is this, I get it that you don't want to throw people out onto the street that are going to die, but there's got to be a way to get out in front of it so that somebody that's in arrears knows they're in arrears, and you keep after them until they start making some payment, whether it's full payment or partial payment or what have you. That's a comment. I guess a question is, what else is at your disposal aside from going to the land, aside from eviction? Are there any other tools at your disposal that can be used?
So we do, and Graham can certainly augment this, but we do enter into repayment agreements with them. So if I owe $1,000,
Aside from the repayment agreement, are there any other tools at your disposal?
Graham, do you want to speak to this? I mean, I think the short answer to the question is it's either eviction or mediated agreement.
Yeah, so that is the short answer. Unfortunately, the Residential Tenancies Act only affords us the ability to evict somebody who doesn't pay their rent. All the other efforts that we make are really to get them to enter into repayment agreements, because at the time we implemented the collection process we use today, that was the value that was expressed by the board for us to pursue.
So who's responsible for, if a tenant isn't paying on the due date that's supposed to be paid first of the month, last of the month, whatever, who's responsible for notifying the tenant that payment is past
Essentially, my division is.
But is it the superintendent? Is it who? I mean, what individual? Is it a knock on the door? Is it a letter?
It's a combination of all those things. So our collection process starts with a letter on the third or fourth day to inform them, hey, we haven't received your rental payment. Immediately following that, over the course of several days, we attempt a personal contact, whether that's a phone call or a door knock. And at that point, after those two steps have been undertaken, we serve what's called an N4, which is the first stage in a legal process. As an example to what Kevin was talking about, we're evaluating advancing that N4 service. Tenants, by and large, ignore the letter and they ignore the first phone call and door knock. So we have to affect a shift in the behavior for them to understand the gravity of not paying their rent. And by advancing the N4, which is it's a legal looking document, we're hoping to influence the sense that we're serious that you got to pay your rent, and we're not going to let it linger. A lot of the delays right now is because we prescribed a process based around the characteristics the ombudsman wanted us to have in the process. And it has shifted a behavior. A lot of tenants think that they have a lot of avenues not to pay their rent, and that's really the fundamental change that we want to affect in fixing the process.
Okay, thank you.
Paula?
Just quickly, in those numbers, and maybe I'm missing it, how many are beyond a month?
Graham, do you have the
Percentage-wise.
stats of how many units are beyond it? I think I've got it. Just give me a second.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, sometimes you just get late.
Thank you.
Because you got three
I think
motions here.
a month.
It's page 8 of the report, Counselor.
Yes.
There's an aging outline.
Yes, I'm asking that question though, thank you.
So it's how many units are in that number?
So if we take a month and then we take out from 1 month, beyond a month, that's what I'm looking at, percentage-wise.
So the table expresses it in context of the value of arrears. So if the unit counts, I would have to pull a separate report, but I could certainly provide that.
So I am interested in that because a few days slippage and now you're considered in arrears compared to somebody that's 4 months in arrears. And I think there's a landing spot there that we should understand that Mr. Campbell's concerned that that's a high number. It might not be as high if it's within that month payment. And I'd like to be clear on that because I do know tenants, sometimes they're a few days late or a week late, and then all of a sudden they're in part of the arrears numbers. And they also, lots of tenants in the city are a few days late and then catch up. So we need to set the line as to where that's a chronic not payer or somebody who's just not managed that month. And I'd like to know what that is.
So just as I'm looking at the schedule, here, so in July 19, there was, in rent and parking arrears, there was, $9.4 million in rent and parking arrears. Roughly a third of that, so $3 million of that is 30 days or less. And then, so obviously the balance of that, 2/3 of that is beyond that. And of that 2/3, pretty close to a third of it is beyond 120 days. And I want to remind, I want to be kind of stressed that if you're in a repayment agreement for rent that is beyond 120 days, it's going to show up in the 120 days column. So you could have a situation where tenants are current in their repayment agreement and current in their current rent, but will show a very dramatic aging because we're addressing a repayment agreement that is, 6 months for arrears at 6 months or greater or older. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense to me. I'm not sure if it understands it, going through it. And I'm prepared to bring a more wholesome discussion around arrears and the things that we're thinking of and from a process change, to the next, through BIFAC, through tenant services, and then up to the next board meeting.
Taking into account there's tenants that are just refusing to pay and others who are scrambling to pay. And I don't want to persecute tenants that are just scrambling to pay,
Right.
pulling the money together.
I agree with
Trying
you.
to help them.
Yep.
People that are just flagrantly not paying,
Yep.
that there are different numbers. So I think when we see these numbers in this way, and John Campbell says, my God, that's a big number, but I think we have to disaggregate that a little bit.
Yeah. And so I think this is one of those things where we aren't helped by our current systems. It takes a fair bit for us to get into, do the analytics, underneath this, and it's not an excuse. I'm just, stating a fact, but we will look, we will bring this forward through BIFAC and Tenant Services Committee.
And can I ask one more question? When somebody finds them, obviously, when tenants find themselves in this situation and it just gets harder and it seems hopeless, do they have access to OACH in order to help them get back?
Absolutely.
Because previously, it was only for seniors and others couldn't have access to OACH. So I'd like to know if
Yeah.
it's only for seniors.
No, that's not the case. OACH gets involved in
thinks
other files. They spend most of their times on senior-related issues because that was their primary focus, but that is not exclusive to the seniors group.
And it can only be dealt with by OACH if it's referred to OACH, rather than somebody who may have had interactions with tenant services and then trying to get ahead. I'm just unclear in the
Yeah.
pathway. So when you bring that report, let's just really look at everything to try to make tenants
do the soup
as
to nuts on it.
successful as
Yeah.
possible,
Yeah.
with access to as many helping hands as they can to get back on their feet, because nobody likes to be in arrears unless you're deliberately trying to be in arrears.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I agree.
Any further questions? So actually, I'd like to wrap the item 3A and B all under one motion. So if I could have one motion to receive the report, that would be great. Adele, the seconder? Uba. Thank you very much. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried.
what's the next item?
We're going to item 4.
Just a point,
Sure.
and it's probably to Kevin or Sheila, that the website still indicates that OACH is only for seniors.
Oh, does it? Okay, so that should be corrected.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for noting that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Item 4 is the Governance, Communications, and Human Resources Committee, which is myself. And we haven't met since the last board meeting, so there's no report to make at this point. We will have one at the next meeting when we'll have had a committee meeting prior to the next board meeting. So I'm not sure we need there's no motion required for that. The next one is the Tenant Services Committee. Linda, do you have anything to report?
No motions for this one either, but I think worth noting that at our last board meeting, we did actually bring the tenant engagement refresh system. That has been a very important item for the tenant services, and I just want to note that we actually took a full meeting with a significant amount of time, and many board members actually came to that meeting. My apologies. I'll repeat that on tenant services, that we actually had a board meeting, joint tenant services board meeting in July to actually review particularly the tenant refresh system. And I know that there's some things that are now rolling out, but that it was very significant that this was a piece of work that our committee had been looking at for over a year with much tenant engagement. And at that meeting, we heard from, I think, over 20 tenants. I think it was an example of actually taking a meeting and focusing it specifically on hearing the voice of the tenants and actually then approving and moving forward. It's not perfect, and I think that even in rollout, there's sometimes the interpretation. So I think what we've got to make sure that we do is make sure that the hard work that the tenants actually put into this is rolled into the staff actually understanding what the expectations are, and I'm sure lots of them do, but to actually the execution, you can have a great document, but if you don't actually execute well and thoughtfully, that's really important.
Well, and that speaks to
Exactly.
in part what
Exactly.
Miguel was
So I think
raising
that we
earlier.
will be continuing to actually monitor the success of that or the challenges. We did actually acknowledge that it's a bit of a dynamic document and that if there's things that actually aren't working and that the outcome is actually tenant engagement, to look at that. And then the other item, I think that it's worth just that we're monitoring closely tenants first and a lot of the initiatives that are happening under there and the rollout of the seniors building the project, which was approved by council. And I think it's just worth noting at this board meeting those significant items that actually are going to impact how we provide services to seniors.
Right, and I think just if I can just add to what Linda was saying with regard to the tenants first aspect of it, there are kind of two key motions that came out of City Council. One, obviously, I mean, there are multiple motions, but two key activities. One around the seniors organization and it moving to a new city corporation, and the other with regard to the development functions moving through to create TO, effectively. Chris Murray has, the city manager, has started a monthly review process that he and I co-chair the meeting in terms of the due diligence that's going on and the progress that they're making in that regard. We had a first meeting earlier, either very late, I think it was in early September. We had a first meeting and it had his deputy city managers and the folks that are involved in that. My intent on a go-forward basis is to invite Chris to this particular meeting so that the two of us can provide this board with an update on the actions that are going on relative to that. And those meetings are typically at the beginning of the month. I think it's in the first week of the month that he's got those meetings scheduled for. So that should line up well with our board meetings.
Okay. Thank you very much. Should probably have a motion to receive since we did have some information. Moved by Linda, seconded by John. Thank you. All those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. The next item is the BIFAC Chair's report. Adele, you want to?
Yes, the public meeting of BIFAC was held on August 13th. The consent agenda was approved as presented, and we did have two other items for discussion. The first was the receipt of a report on the update of the key initiatives that are included in the Emergency Management Tenant Program. We received that from the Senior Director of Fire, Life Safety, and Risk Management. The second item was the Fir Grove Grassways Revitalization Business Plan. This was received and got unanimous support from the committee to recommend that this plan comes to the board for approval. And I'm going to ask the Chief Development Officer, Vincent, to speak to it before the board considers it for approval.
So we've,
through the chair, as Adele had mentioned, we had considered the Fir Grove Master Plan.
Sorry, that's working, but we have a deputant who had asked to speak to this matter.
Oh, sorry.
Just
Okay.
before we move into it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize that.
I think Ms. Holness, Shannon Holness.
welcome.
Good morning. My name is Shannon Holness, and I stand here before you today wearing my many hats. I'm an urban planner. I'm the Neighborhood Environmental Improvements Coordinator at the Toronto Community Benefits Network. I sit on the city's Community Healing Advisory in response to the National Gun Violence Strategy, and I am a proud resident of Fir Grove, where after being relocated and displaced, I now sit on the Fir Grove Focus Revitalization Advisory. The first time I had to make a deputation to any TCHC board, it was because my housing had been condemned and me and my community were in the thick of a relocation process that lacked compassion in the most pressing ways. At the time, we were told that there was no money to demolish the 134 units that were shuttered and therefore no money to even conceive of a rebuild. And so just over 2 years later, to be standing here talking about two possible density scenarios and between $120 and $171 million in investment is incredible, and what Fir Grove and, broadly speaking, the neighborhood of Jane and Finch deserves. After years of disinvestment and systemic neglect that manifested into a lack of investment in physical and social infrastructure and lives lost in the wake of such a scene, this is what Jane and Finch deserves. I want to take a moment to explore neighborhood trauma and what it means and how it has shown up in this master planning process. While I believe that the master plan that is presented here does reflect and capture the voices of residents who participated in the process, there are some realities and experiences that cannot be expressed in this way or captured by those who do not have the lived experience of neighborhood trauma. I want to share an excerpt from a talk I did at the Design Exchange called Designing Safe Cities. I'll begin now. The definitions of urban trauma and community trauma describe how ongoing root causes of social inequities and the erasure of culture and communities disrupt the physical environment and the social and cultural networks. Urban planning is underrepresented in conversations about mental health. This is an urgent oversight as the city is projecting for growth. Historically marginalized communities experience cycles of growth and change through gentrification and revitalization processes. These processes facilitate displacement and upend significant placemaking practices. As we collectively witness our communities change, our mental maps of the city are also disrupted, and that is a challenge that is compounded against the legacy of community trauma and how it manifests. Generally speaking, social housing communities are usually used as examples of bad urban planning and bad urban design. The lack of connection to our city's grid and the enclosed design has been cited as adding to the safety risks for residents of these communities. And revitalization seeks to introduce the community to the city's grid to create connected streets. But how does this translate on the ground in communities that have a legacy of gun violence? In the community's response to the master planning process, particularly from the youth, they have expressed that they want the community to remain enclosed and with fences. They are worried about the introduction of streets into the community's design, and they believe that the streets will make the community more vulnerable to drive-by shootings. What they are expressing is an anxiety with the new design. They do not want new people to come to be able to come into the community or to have such easy access to the community. And unfortunately, there's no real capacity on any level to address the impact of gun violence on households as our communities are being reshaped and reconfigured by revitalization, and as we continue to move through our society with these traumas and carry those anxieties everywhere we go. There has to be consideration for how revitalization can distort mental maps of community members and the impact of this as we are integrating these revitalized and gentrified communities, particularly as it relates to gun violence. Youth are expressing a desire to be more territorial with the new design because they feel as though their vulnerability is exacerbated by these changes. And at what point do we advocate for and give significant consideration to trauma-informed community engagement in the revitalization process and find ways to introduce best practices and new principles of urban design to a community that is uncomfortable with those changes? I say that to say that we cannot continue to blame an urban design that turned in on itself for the issues that a community like mine faced. We are living through a time of deepening socio-spatial segregation, a defining feature of which is racial inequity. And we need to make space for the true impact of that in our discussions. I remember when I moved to 11 Bluegrass Way, I remember how the building smelled, the community was green, I had way more friends than I ever thought I needed, way more aunties than I ever knew who were always more than generous. Community programming was abundant, but I grew up in the Mike Harris era and I know my time's running out, but the devolution of services really skirmished away at that social infrastructure and negatively impacted the level of cohesion I grew up with and was never able to recover. And neither has Toronto Community Housing, and it has been a challenge to address capital repairs in this context. And so I'm very proud that TCHC is being bold to embark on this project without developers. I appreciate that this was set a standard for planning and development in Jane and Finch, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you could give us a copy of that, we could circulate that to the board. Thank you.
And your whole paper would be great.
All right.
So,
Vincent.
I don't really know how I can follow up on that. So all I'll say is that we have been working with the community over the past 8 months. We've held 5 workshops where, and as Shannon mentioned, we also set up a revitalization working group with stakeholders and members of the community. And I think the master plan that we're presenting today hopefully reflects all the input that we've received throughout this process. On Tuesday, the Strategic Planning and Management Committee at the City of Toronto considered this, the master plan, and they are recommending approval and in principle to proceed to the Planning and Housing Committee, which will be considered on October 17th, I believe, provided that the TCHC board approves it today.
Thanks very much, Vincent.
No pressure for approval. I think, can we just, questions in motion?
Any questions? John?
The deputant spoke of, this is to Vincent, I guess, the deputant spoke of concerns that opening up the community, opening up this area to more street and auto accessibility would lead to a continuance or an extension of violence. And did you hear that? To what extent did you hear that in the consultations? And what is the contrary view?
So yes, we heard it through, there was a youth focus group, and it was raised as a concern that introducing new public streets may encourage drive-by shootings and facilitate a quicker movement through the community in those instances. We took those comments into consideration. We met with CSU, we met with Toronto Police, we did a CPTED analysis, a community crime prevention through environmental design analysis of the plan that we've presented. In addition, what you'll notice in the plan, which is fairly unique for revitalization, is there are no standalone townhouses. We've integrated grade-related units, multi-level grade-related units in all the buildings because in our experience, especially with Regent Park, we found that having standalone townhouses in a grade-related form, there is a higher incidence of drive-by shootings because tenants have really easily identifiable addresses. It's also it's easier for TCHC to operationalize a building and manage security around that building versus having rows and rows of townhouses with individual entrances. So,
In terms of how the roads are designed, were there discussions with, with the experts in the City of Toronto Transportation Group who design roads as to what can be done to mitigate car speeds and so on?
Once the planning application is submitted, those are some of the comments that we'll receive from the different various divisions at the city. As a planning principle, public streets have been found to be safer than privately owned streets. Right. And part of the problem right now is there are no, Jane Jacobs' whole principle of eyes on the street. That the whole premise of this master plan is reintroducing that kind of passive surveillance onto these public streets. And that in itself is in principle supposed to make the community safer.
So Vincent, sorry, if I can just for clarification, because as you're having this discussion, when the deputy was talking about the concerns the tenants raised, the concerns raised about increased opportunity for drive-by shooting, did that come from the TCHC residents, or was that from the surrounding community?
Those were from youth that lived in the community.
Okay, it was from our community. Thank you. Sorry, John. I just want to make sure.
There are 600 market units in the plan, correct?
Correct.
600 market. So it's the 234 townhouses are going to be replaced. Then it says 2 density scenarios. The second scenario comprises a full build-out of the site, which could accommodate up to 107 new additional affordable housing units. But where are the 600 units coming in?
So in your report, if you refer to attachment number 2, the buildings that are circled with the red outline, those are the TCHC replacement buildings, and those have been designed to accommodate the additional 107 net new affordable rental units that are proposed in the full build-out scenario. Okay. And then all of the buildings that are outlined in blue are where the 600 market units are going to go.
And who will own the land with the market unit?
So that's something that we're working with the Housing Secretariat at the City of Toronto on. We're exploring different options.
So presently this is owned by TCHC?
100%.
The buildings will be owned and operated by somebody else, correct?
The market is intended to be operated by someone else. We don't know whether we're going to enter into a long-term land lease or a sale.
Okay, and I guess this will be my last question, let other people go. There is an increase in density. Building 1 is increased from 12 to 16 stories, Building 2 from 16 to 25 stories. Was there concern in the community about the increased density, and was there opposition to the increased density?
No, everyone that we've met with, stakeholders, we also have an interdivisional city group that comprised of mainly of city planning that have been guiding us through this process as well, and all the stakeholders, including the local councillors, supportive of this plan.
Okay, thank you.
Paula, did you have a question? And then Amanda?
Yes, can you just walk me through the number of replacement units?
234. There's 2 units, RGI units, that have been used for community uses. So it's 236 total.
234 replacement RGI units. The number of market units that are condos, the number of market units that are rental market.
So right now it's undetermined whether they're going to be condo or rental, but it's 600 market in that category.
And the number of affordable rental.
107.
And is the intention to break up the 600 and attempt to have some just standalone rental that isn't affordable, but just standalone rental?
Yeah, so that's something we're working with the Housing Secretariat on, is looking at whether, what proportion can be market rental, or maybe it's all market rental, or maybe it's all market ownership. Right now, this neighborhood doesn't have a very strong market ownership market. So as you know, so it's there's some flexibility in what we can do with those market units.
But regardless of what decision is made, it will be 600.
That's just a guess based on an average unit size. Really, it's the gross floor area that we're proposing, but we take an average unit size and then we kind of come up with our best guess of how many units will be there, and it comes out to about 600.
And just from the business plan, there's a park, a community center, and a pool. Is there a community center with a pool on site currently, or?
Yes, it's a TCHC-owned community space.
Oh, okay, with the daycare. And that's a new park or a refurbished park?
It's a brand-new public park that we're proposing.
Okay, and any other new amenities that will be?
There will be an expanded, currently, there's a childcare facility with 46 spaces, and it's proposed to be expanded to 60 plus.
So we're going from 234 to just about 1,000 units on the site.
Approximately.
Densification, and there's a school across the street, and that can accommodate all the new residents.
Correct. We've met with TDSB in a number of meetings.
Good, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Amanda?
Yeah, I just wanted to know where security gates or automatic swing gates ever taken into consideration in the business plan? Because I know I have a family member who lives in a co-op building, and they had problems with drive-by shootings, and once they had those gates installed, they never had a problem with, that's 300 Queens Drive, issues of drive-bys.
I would say that the principle of revitalization is opening up to the community, to its surrounding area. And so we're hoping through the design of the community, through public streets, eyes on the street, introduction of a mix of market rental, market ownership, and other types of tenure, that that socioeconomic mix and the new built form that we're proposing contributes to safety, and we introducing gates kind of is the opposite of what we want to achieve through revitalization, which is building inclusive communities.
But with the gates, could they still not be inclusive?
I mean, that's something that we can continue to consider and have further discussions with the community and how they feel about it. But you know, I would say that as an urban planner, that, you know, it kind of goes against the principle of what we're trying to achieve through revitalization.
Any further questions? I have one. Linda, do you want to?
Actually, if I can just comment on that last thing. I think, I mean, obviously this needs to be reviewed with the housing secretary, and you know, and ultimately it's going to go through council. So I would encourage discussion of those things that would bring forward, you know, those concerns to ensure that you know, that they are adequately addressed. I respect Vincent's view as an urban planner. You know, but I think in terms of these things, if there are specific safety concerns and other solutions that have worked, they need to be balanced in the overall decision. So I would encourage you to bring those forward to the various city organs that are going to be reviewing this.
Linda?
Yeah, just in that spirit of walkability and street life, I assume that many of these buildings would actually have markets and opportunities for businesses that actually then bring life and bring opportunities for people that live in the community?
We are proposing some retail, at-grade retail along Jane Street.
Vincent, I just have a question, because I'm not fully familiar with the community, but the community center and daycare and pool, does that already exist, or is that something that needs refurbishing or investment?
It exists and it needs refurbishment. The pool was recently done, I think, about a year and a half ago, or maintained. But as part of the rebuild, we had plans to rebuild the pool.
And I guess in terms of discussion with the community, because I know there's a lot of organizations or some organizations in the community that work outside of that parameters, and having those resources, have they been participating in looking at what kind of supports and how we can facilitate and support those groups that build community through those voluntary organizations included in the plan and the planning?
I believe through the revitalization working group, stakeholders have been participating in the process, and we have met with many area stakeholders.
So is there opportunities for them to provide whatever resources they have and the community wants to be included in the planning and bringing those resources right into the community?
I would say that nothing is prohibiting that. We're really at the front end of this new revitalization approvals framework. Really, we're just approving this in principle so that we can start that longer conversation of going through the official City of Toronto planning approvals process.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Miguel. Uwe, you have a question.
Forgive me if someone asked this question already. When you're doing the planning, did you include tenants to be part of that planning and part of the consultation?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had 5 official open houses and workshops with tenants in the community. In addition, we had set up the revitalization working group, and we also opened up a revitalization drop-in in one of the vacant units so that if any tenants had any questions, they can come and ask staff.
Paula?
Quick question. Has there been any conversation in turning that community center and pool over to the city to be a city community center?
Yes, we've started that, and so and at SPMC, Anne-Marie Nasser attended, and so we'll continue those discussions.
Amanda?
With the retail spaces, will the residents have priority?
That's something that we can consider. It's not built into our business plan right now, and it depends on who will actually own the retail spaces, like if they're in the market building or if they're in the TCHC building. So, for example, in Alexandra Park, as part of that revitalization, we donated, as part of the development approvals, space for a local social enterprise. But it was funded through Section 37 funds that the councillor redirected towards kind of paying for the cost of that retail space, and then tenants can then use that space to start their local businesses or however. So that's something we can consider here. But of course, the implication is if you take away some of that retail revenue, then the deficit grows higher.
Okay, I think we should.
So maybe I could call the question, first of all, to receive Adele, or the BIFAC report that Adele presented, to receive that. So if I could have a mover and a seconder. Great, Debbie and Paula.
You got the motion.
And the second motion is for the approval of the Fir Grove plan that was presented by Vincent and Adele. So Adele is moving that. Is there a seconder? Linda, thank you very much. Any further discussion, questions? If none, please indicate your move on that item. Thank you. All in favor? Motion's carried. So we're moving now to item 7, which was the new item, the CMHC National Housing Co-Investment Fund. And Kevin, are you going to speak to that?
Sure, I'm going to speak to that. Sorry, was there just a question that you guys wanted to clarify before we started? Okay, so, all right, I am, the board directors have a copy of my comments, folks.
Okay. Any questions? Was there?
Yes, we did. We're to move forward.
Sorry, was there?
Oh, there's a question.
With regard to Fir Grove?
No, with respect to
Okay. Sorry?
Amanda, go ahead.
Amanda's asking for a recorded vote. She's.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry about that, Amanda. We're back just to make sure there's a recorded vote on the Fir Grove approval. So if we could just go around the table and everybody indicate their approval. So Adele, John, Debbie, Paula, Amanda, do you have abstain or abstaining? Uba? Pardon, sorry. Abstaining is? Safety issue. Okay. Michael? Favor? Linda? And myself. Thank you. The motion is carried with 2 abstentions. Is that okay?
All right, thank you. Okay, so given that I'm going to wait till the discussion at the board has concluded before I start my remarks.
So if we could focus on the CMHC National Housing Co-Investment Fund, which is in front of us and has long-term impact for the organization. So, okay. Kevin.
So if I can start out, on this. Had we had this sort of a plan in place, situations where Fir Grove wasn't rehabilitated as part of our, regular repair program would have already been dealt with. I mean, I was, in the organization on the board when Fir Grove, we had to close the units in Fir Grove and move individuals out in a very rapid fashion and less than ideal. And that is certainly not what we would like to see forward. So I'm very happy to bring forward the CMHC National Housing Co-Investment Fund proposal. And the purpose of this discussion is to seek the approval of the board to enter into the borrowing arrangements with CMHC to pursue the National Co-Investment Fund beginning in 2019. And just by way of background on this, you'll recall that Ontario, on April 5, 2019, the federal government announced a commitment of $1.34 billion in funding over 9 years under the National Housing Co-Investment Fund to repair and renew TCHC's social aging stock. Aging social stock. In order to activate this agreement, which is proposed to provide TCHC through a combination of forgivable loans and repayable loans, this report seeks the board director's approval of the terms and conditions contained in the term sheet reviewed earlier. The parties under this proposed term sheet are the city as guarantor, TCHC as the borrower, and the federal government through CMHC as the lender. The city and TCHC are well positioned to deploy the funding within the terms of the proposal. Implementation will take place over 9 years and will include the repair and renewal of the entire TCHC portfolio comprising of 58,860 units. The funding requires that TCHC comply with the National Housing Co-Investment Fund criteria with respect to affordability, with respect to accessibility, and with respect to energy efficiency. And through this proposed partnership, TCHC can improve the condition of the portfolio and provide tenants with access to safe, well-maintained, and affordable homes. With regard to financial implications, TCHC will receive up to $1.34 billion from the federal government under this program over 9 years, and it comprises of $527.5 million in forgivable loans and $813.5 million in low-interest repayable loans. As the proposed loans are unsecured, the additional debt of $1.34 billion will not affect TCHC's ability within its financial leverage component of 30% as stipulated under our master covenant agreement with major lenders. Qualification for this loan, for this funding requires guarantees of the loan from the city as the sole shareholder of TCHC, And you'll recall that I mentioned earlier, the city is considering this item at executive committee, and the report going to executive committee was dropped yesterday on the city website. The city does require that the TCHC board, as a first step in that approval process, approve the agreement that we have with the city and CMHC today, and I am asking for that approval.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Are there questions? John?
How much of the money will be earmarked for the seniors' portfolio of buildings? Is that going to be done on a pro rata basis, or how is that going to be determined, or a building condition basis?
Could I interrupt you for a minute, because we do have someone who wants to make a deputation before your question, if that's
Sure.
fine. Thank you. Miguel?
Remember my question.
Welcome to federal elections 2019. It feels like Christmas again, doesn't it? So politicians made promises in April, and Justin Trudeau made a commitment to $1.3 billion. So I think we are going to go in a good way to get this money. My questions are as follows. We have a situation with Phase 2 of Region Park in terms of lack of cameras. Will this money be available to supply with missing cameras in Phase 2 of Region Park revitalization? Because we have been suffering for this for years. And hopefully, my petition for cameras for G20 Oak will be approved based on this money that is available. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much,
Miguel.
Oh, sure.
Briefly.
Cheryl?
Okay, I'm sorry to harp on this,
No.
but I'm thinking, transparency and accountability. Can I see where this money is being spent when it's being spent?
Sure, it is part of it. We actually do, publish our capital building repair plans.
Yeah, I
and-
want more details on those too, but yeah.
Well, okay, but in terms of, the idea is to share with you, so you will see where this is being spent. We have provided CMHC with our 10-year plan as
Okay.
part of this discussion and proposal, and that is a public document that is available.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. And by the way, I do want to remind all of those who are here today that this is an item that is going before the city executive committee, and so that there will be plenty of opportunity for those who have questions and concerns to depute at the executive committee, as is typical of the city process.
Kathy, you want to? So one more deputy, Kathy? Birch?
Yeah, I just think that it would help everybody, Kevin, if it became really clear about what that funding is earmarked for, that it's for energy efficiency, accessibility. And I know you've said it, but I think people are not catching it that money is specified,
Right.
that it can only be used for these things.
Right.
And the outreaches of those things. And I think tenants are not understanding that. So somehow we need to educate everybody specifically to that funding and what it's for, please.
Right, and I'm glad to do that. We are under specific restriction from the city on what we can and can't share at this time, because they want to be the people that share that information. And so that's why I encourage all of you who have questions on it to attend executive committee and make sure that your deputations and questions are heard. Okay, there's some stuff I can share with you. There's some stuff that they've asked me not to share at this time. Sorry, John, back to
So
your
we're
question.
back to John. Thank you for your question, John.
So the question is in regard to the apportionment of funds to the seniors' portfolio. Will it be done on a pro rata basis, or will it be done based on building condition?
So the seniors portfolio is included in this. and it is done on building, it's done on building condition. It follows the 10-year plan, and the 10-year plan is agnostic between whether it's a seniors building or a non-seniors building that we repair. And the point that I want to emphasize, our goal is to get back to a 10% facilities condition index. And at the end of this plan, with this funding and the matching programs from the city that are required as part of this plan, we will be at that 10% FCI in our building portfolio.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Other questions? Any other questions? If I have no further questions, I'll ask for the motion to approve. Are you asking a question, John? Or?
You're asking for the motion?
I was asking for a motion. Okay, I wasn't quite sure whether you had another question. So, asking for a mover, John. A seconder? Linda? All those in favor? Motion is carried.
That motion to adjourn.
So I'd like to thank everyone for their input today, and at this point, I'll look for a motion to adjourn. You have a question, Uba?
No.
Or are you moving?
No, it's just a comment. Last month, as most of you know, there was a 16-year-old who got killed in his building at, where was it, Falstaff? And TCHC came, especially the executive, all the executives, Kevin, Graham, William, Sheila, and other, Linda Diaz, I just want to remember people, and they did a fantastic job just providing support to the family, and that family within a month is moved to a new location thanks to all your input, and I really just want to, say thank you so much, and I really appreciate your support. I was there as a board member that day just to support the family, and just to go back to what one of the debatants saying, I strongly believe we need more commerce, especially those stairs. I know it's dollar and money, and it's going to take more money, but safety comes before money, and it should come before money. And the other piece that same person mentioned was to have this new constable that we're hiring to make sure that they are trained well, anti-oppression, anti-discriminatory, and what have you, and we need that. I also ask, and I believe the Councillor Fletcher asked in the past, just a breakdown of who are we hiring? Those 59 people, who are they? We want to know, is there diversity of people, how many women, how many are, people with disability, how many are people of color? We need to know that. So if we can get that report sometime in the future, that would be great. Thanks again for your support.
Thanks very much for those comments, but it's very important in those tragic situations to be there to support families. Thank you. And did we do with the motion? I lost track of.
I can't do the motion, so thank you. I appreciate those comments, and I'll restate it now as I restated it at the Falstaff meeting. The solution for safety and security and gun and gang violence, in this city is a complex, solution that requires all three levels of government to participate in. We cannot security camera our way out of it. We cannot police our way out of this situation, and it is a situation that requires considerable investment, and I will continue to push for that.
So, thanks very much. If I could ask for a motion to adjourn. Adele, seconder. Uba, thank you very much. Those in favor, motion's carried. Yes, just to remind the board, we still have some more work to do, so we'll take a short break before we come back in the confidential session. Thank you.
Why are the constables here? Oh. I always have them, I've never noticed them before. I've never noticed them before. Oh, okay. Okay,
Oh, okay, so you got the link.